The sun had just begun peeking its way over the horizon. Tendrils of light crept along the hillside, their warmth slowly staving off the twilight chill. Brunwyn yawned as she poured freshly brewed tea out for her companions. "So what's the plan? Are we supposed to be meeting someone about the job?" Rasheda nodded as she swallowed a bite of grilled jerky. "Apparently a representative of the Lord's Alliance should arrive shortly after sunup," she said.
"Oh, we'll know when they get here,"
Grognak said, with a snort.
"Those self-important peacocks never fail to make a spectacle."
They had made their way to this sleepy little hamlet to respond to a notice they had seen on a message board in Daggerford.
"Adventurers wanted! Flamerule Farmsmeet imperiled by pests of giant proportions. All interested parties report to Gillian's Hill. Pay will be handsome for a job well done. In the name of the Lord's Alliance."
Brunwyn and her companions had not been the only ones drawn here by the prospect of good coin. Sharing the warmth of their fire was a tanned human woman wearing a rust-flecked breastplate, a halfling in a cloak that was obviously too long for him, a half-elf wearing a pair of half-moon spectacles, and a kobold clad in leathers. They had arrived at the settlement shortly after the previous sundown and had asked the dwarf and her friends if they could join their camp for the night. "We, didn't realize this place doesn't have an inn," the human woman had said sheepishly. "So, Holly, the night under the stars treats you okay?" Brunwyn asked, passing the human a steaming tin cup. "Makes sleeping in the family stable's hayloft feel like luxury, but it was uneventful enough," she replied. "Rathked won't stop complaining about his aching back, though." The half-elf shot her a look from over his spectacles. "Well, I don't blame him. Even on a bedroll in a canvas tent, the cold ground is a cruel mistress to spend one's night with," Cantheo quipped, sipping his tea.
"Softy,"
Grognak grunted, running a whetstone along the blade of one of his axes. As the sun made its way higher into the sky, farmers rolled their way here and there into the settlement with carts and wagons loaded with produce. The center of Gillian's Hill had started to resemble a small market. Brunwyn yawned again, stretching her arms above her head. "Still no sign of our contact yet?" "Not yet," a voice called out. Dak, the halfling, had climbed a nearby tree so that he could keep a lookout. "Well, I suppose there's no rush. Maybe we can get fresh ingredients for a proper meal," the dwarf said, looking longingly towards the agricultural assortment behind them. All seemed peaceful. That is, until a low, short rumbling pealed out through the hills.
"Huh! I didn't think it was supposed to rain today!"
Scrat squeaked. The kobold put a finger in his mouth, then raised it to the wind. Barely a moment had passed when a second rumble filled the air. Then another. And another. The ground began to shake, slightly at first, gradually vibrating more with each additional sound. Kenthiel began to trace signs around himself with a piece of cured leather. The air shimmered ever so slightly as he traced, as if he were painting using colors Brunwyn's eyes couldn't detect. "Can never be too careful," he mused. The Farmsmeet filled with worried murmuring. Some farmers began hesitantly wheeling away their carts. "I have a feeling we're about to see just what those pests of giant proportions are," Brunwyn said. "Shed, can you get up that fire tower and keep us covered? If anything goes bad, I'll help guide your first shot and keep the rest of you lot patched up." Rasheda nodded and took off behind them. The thundering was getting louder, and the ground was starting to feel unsteady under the adventurers' feet. Brunwyn closed her eyes and stilled herself, her hand clasped firmly around her holy symbol. "Maraud and protect us. Guide our hands and make them tools in your grand design," Brunwyn prayed. The dwarf smiled as she and her companions began to glow with a faint, warm light, like flickering flames illuminating a forge. Brunwyn's eyes flew open as she felt something tugging her attention forwards. "Watch out!" she cried, as she dropped to the ground. A large cauldron sailed over her towards Kenthiel. The elf frowned as he uttered an arcane phrase, surrounding himself in a bubble of purple energy. The cauldron stopped mid-flight, then fell to the ground with a loud clang. "Nothing can ever be easy, can it?" he scoffed.
"Wow! That was close! Good thing it didn't hit us!"
Scret remarked. Just as the words had left his scaly lips, a huge boulder flew through the air and landed squarely on top of his half-elf companion with a loud crash. Brunwyn winced. Oof, bad luck. Hallie and Scret stood stunned, their jaws agape. Dak let out a terrified whimper from up in the tree. Don't worry, I'm, sure he'll be okay, the dwarf said. Another boulder slammed into the ground, directly next to the first one. The kobold let out a terrified shriek, threw his arms over his head, and ran off wailing. Well, I suppose good help is hard to find these days, Kenthiel sighed, shaking his head. Two towering figures emerged from the surrounding hills, running towards Gillian's Hill with heavy, lumbering steps. They shouted back and forth to each other as they crashed towards the settlement. Brunwyn could feel her bones vibrate with each thundering syllable. The dwarf could now clearly tell that they were about to be assailed by a pair of giants, one male and one female. Try as she might to keep herself calm, her breaths quickened as she beheld these behemoth foes. Heavy animal hides stitched haphazardly together formed a pair of titanic trousers that covered the lower half of the giantess. Her shins had large pieces of tree bark secured around them, held in place with filthy and frayed lengths of rope. She pointed a colossal wooden club towards the wagons and carts of farm goods in the center of the settlement.
Food!
She bellowed.
Get!
The giantess slapped the male giant in the back of his head. He responded with a pained groan as he nodded and lumbered forward. Upon seeing the enormous tan-skinned brute plodding directly towards them, the remaining farmers panicked. Grabbing whatever they could carry, they ran scrambling and shouting towards the back of the settlement and the woods beyond. The strident high notes of a bugle rang out through the chaos. Brunwyn turned and saw a knight in gleaming plate armor spurring his horse forward, a crimson plume fluttering atop his frogmouth helm like an angry flame. In his left hand, he carried a standard emblazoned with a white crown against a red and gold background, the symbol of the Lord's Alliance.
Say what I mean!
Grognak yelled, the corners of his mouth curled up into a smirk. Behind the knight rode a smaller figure atop a pony. Clad in a crimson brigandine and sporting a jaunty red and gold Tudor cap, the figure lowered a polished brass bugle from its lips. As the pair rode nearer, Brunwyn could see that the smaller rider had dark red skin. Large, pointed ears poked out from under its hat. Is that a goblin? The dwarf said, in disbelief. A goblin in the employ of the Lord's Alliance? Well, now, I've seen everything, Kenthiel remarked.
Forgive me for the delay! I am Sir Obethius Fontavian Clung, Knight of the Lord's Alliance, Champion of Neverwinter, and Preservator of the Prosperity of the Realms!
The knight triumphantly called out.
And this,
he said, gesturing with the butt of a javelin to the goblin behind him,
is my squire, Gurgles. We'll draw off the female. You handle the male.
As he rode past the giantess, he hurled his javelin straight into her forearm. Her angry howl shook the stones of the low wall next to where Brunwyn stood. With two massive fingers, the giantess plucked out the javelin and snapped it like a twig. She turned her attention towards Sir Clung.
Bad Hume!
She roared.
Get you!
All right, Can, that got our attention, Brunwyn called. If you and Grognak have a plan, get it going.
I'm ready for you, you overgrown sausage,
Grognak growled.
Let's give him the big boy special.
He took a step forward, slamming his fist into the rune etched into the center of his cuirass. Brunwyn watched as the half-orc's eyes started to glow white. Light began pulsing through his veins. Grognak let out a short grunt. Then he began to grow, increasing to the size of an ogre in a matter of moments. I didn't know you could do that, the dwarf called out excitedly. I've got your flank, big guy, Hallie shouted as she ran past Brunwyn. Hey, you let go of that. The giant had grabbed a cart piled high with watermelons. Hallie gripped the cart's handle with both hands and tried to yank it backwards. With as much effort as a child lifting a book off a table, The enormous brute hoisted the cart into the air and brought it up to his face, inspecting its contents. "Put me down! Put me down!" the woman said, slamming her boot into the giant's enormous, bulbous nose. The immense intruder squinted for a moment, then drew in a breath.
Achoo!
The sneeze hit the human like a furious gale, sending her flying off the cart, through the air, and into the orchard on the outskirts of the hamlet. Brunwyn winced as she heard Halle crashing her way down through the trees. "Doc!" the dwarf shouted to the nearby tree. "Stay put! Can, do your thing!" The elf chanted as he drew a pinch of powdered iron from his side pouch. He sprinkled it in front of him in a half circle, then pointed at Grognak. "Just a warning, this might sting a bit." The half-orc's already large form grew in size until he stood almost eye to eye with the giant, who looked utterly shocked that another huge creature had seemingly appeared out of nowhere. Grognak began yelling at the giant in the same guttural language it had been speaking before. Brunwyn couldn't understand him, but she could make out words like Krigga and Farask. The giant's puzzled expression softened as it let out a booming laugh. Brunwyn had to steady herself as its voice rocked the hill. The giant pointed and began shouting at Grognak.
Neotin! Neotin! Gefa! Gefa!
In response, Grognak slammed an axe into the giant's chest, catching it off guard and causing it to stagger backwards. "Something tells me that negotiations are breaking down," Kenthiel shouted. The giant took a step forward, steadying itself. In one motion, it grabbed the tree Dak had climbed, ripped it out by the roots, and swung it in a wide arc, catching Grognak squarely in the jaw. "Hope you're ready with that bullshed," Brunwyn called out, as she flung a bolt of light at the belligerent brute. It grunted as the attack hit its mark, causing the giant to glow red with spectral flames. The dwarf watched a bolt of lavender light streak across her field of view, then slam itself into the side of the giant's shoulder. It seemed unbothered, keeping its focus centered on the huge half-orc in front of it. "Try hitting it with something a little harder," Kenthiel yelled, as he shot a small jet of flame from his fingertip. Brunwyn watched as Grognak maneuvered his way around the giant, bashing it again with an axe blow.
Fire!
He bellowed. Another arrow sailed forward. When this one found its target, it exploded into a shower of hundreds of thorns that plunged themselves into the giant's back. Small dribbles of blood trickled down its tanned skin. The giant growled in frustration. It grabbed Grognak's wrist as the half-orc attempted to land another blow. With its free hand, the giant quickly scooped up a large rock from the ground and sent it sailing towards the fire tower. The missile slammed into the aged structure, punching a hole into its front in a spray of wood and stone. "No shed!" Brunwyn yelled. As Kenthiel turned to see what had happened, a piece of debris flew straight into the center of his forehead. He yowled in pain, dropping to a knee. Bits of static flickered around Grognak's body. The half-orc shrank back down to the size of an ogre, still large, but now much smaller than the giant. Brunwyn gasped as she watched the fire tower topple backwards. Suddenly, a puff of mist appeared next to her, out of which rolled Rasheda. "You're a right crafty one," the dwarf laughed, placing a hand on her companion. A long gash across Rasheda's cheek glowed red as it seared shut. She nodded her thanks as she quickly sent 2 more arrows sailing towards the giant's back.
Elf!
Grognak roared.
I'm gonna carve this arsehole's guts open. You blast him in the back.
The half-orc unleashed a flurry of frenzied slashes with his axes, sending sprays of crimson from the giant's torso with each hit. The giant bellowed, responding by slamming its tree club onto the top of Grognak's head, sending him reeling back. "The extra space is much appreciated," Kenthiel called, as he raised a small ball of white and yellow material between his thumb and forefinger. A huge ball of flame erupted around the giant, engulfing its head and torso.
Taste my lance!
Sir Clung's voice boomed. Brunwyn turned to see the knight ride full speed towards the giantess, slamming his lance into her now exposed leg. The weapon, which looked to be carved out of some type of large bone, seemed to hum and vibrate for a moment as its tip found its target. A loud crack pierced the air as the giantess was sent sprawling backwards, blood pouring from her fresh leg wound. Her back hit the ground, which shook from the force of the impact. Sir Clung let loose a battle cry as he leapt from his horse, lance in both hands, driving its point into the exposed throat of the giantess. A loud, hideous gurgle escaped her lips. Then her limbs fell limply to the ground. Brunwyn was impressed, but could only marvel at the sight for a moment before another loud sound grabbed her attention. As she wheeled around, she was utterly confused by what she saw. The male giant, who only a few moments before was ferociously fighting her companions, was now flat on his behind, large tears pouring down his soot-blackened cheeks.
Hold on! I don't... That's... What?
The giant began blubbering in the same guttural language Brunwyn had heard it speak before.
Bastard says he's sorry. That he just wanted some food,
Grognak translated, putting a large hand to the bruise forming on his head.
Now that his mate's dead, he says he promises to leave and never come back.
The dwarf let out a ragged, relieved sigh. The master of the forge demands we temper our courage with mercy. Give him an earful and send him on his way. Grognak barked a response back in giant, pointing towards the hills in the distance. The giant nodded, rose to his feet, then began lumbering away, his tears making loud splashes on the ground as he went. After a few moments, Dak fell the few remaining feet from the uprooted tree to the ground, visibly unconscious. Brunwyn shook her head as she made her way over to attend to him.
Beautifully done, fellows,
Sir Clung beamed. Many thanks, Kenthiel replied, with a slight bow. I must say, you were quite impressive yourself, taking down that giantess single-handed.
Oh, I barely did a thing,
the knight said, waving his gauntleted hand.
Gurgles was the one that took care of her leg protection. Without him, I never would have been able to strike the final blow.
Grazie, amico. Non è stato niente,
the goblin said, with a slightly embarrassed shrug.
He doesn't speak a lick of the common tongue, but he's a good lad, that Gurgles. Now, we must discuss the matter of payment. Oi!
A voice called out, interrupting the knight.
We got your man! Throw them weapons down nice and slow-like, or his throat gets slashed.
A muscled man clad in black-studded leather emerged from the tree line. He had Scret lifted with one hand. The other held a curved blade to the kobold's throat.
Perhaps I should mention that the Lord's Alliance will compensate for the dispersal of brigands,
Sir Clung said quietly. Brunwyn quickly said a prayer to Moradin as she pointed a hand towards the intruder. His blade began glowing white-hot. He shrieked, dropping his sword and his hostage.
You are right, Can,
Brunwyn remarked.
It never can be easy.
Thanks for joining us on Browsing the Bestiary. Be sure to subscribe for more episodes and check out our Patreon at Browsing the Bestiary, all one word. We've also added a link tree to our Patreon, so now you can find us on Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, and YouTube.
On Patreon, you can keep up to date on any new pod-related announcements, access reference pages for each episode, and download character sheets for characters featured in our story times. You can also comment on what you think the next monster will be, and if you get it right, you'll get inspiration.
And if you're something of a lore master yourself, you can offer us corrections for any facts we got wrong. If you catch something we missed, you may get a shout-out in a future episode.
Remember to cite your sources.
And before we go, we'd like to shout out our patrons. Thank you to Carl, Holly, Megan, and Kethri for becoming members. I'm Dungeon Mistress Jade.
And I'm Lore Master Andy.
May your dice rolls be high.
And your adventurers ever prepared.
road. I don't know what to do. I'm just a little guy. A little baby guy.